By the autumn of 1777, the American Revolution was far from secure. 2 years after the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, independence was still an idea struggling to survive against reality. The Continental Army was not a professional fighting force. It was a fragile coalition of farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, and volunteers, bound together more by belief than by discipline. George Washington commanded an army that was constantly short on everything that mattered. Gunpowder was rationed, food supplies were unreliable, uniforms were inconsistent, if they existed at all. Many soldiers marched barefoot, leaving bloodstains on frozen ground during long movements. Desertion was a daily concern, especially as enlistment contracts expired and men simply went home. Against them stood the British Empire. Not just an army, but a global military power with decades of combat experience, professional officers, and one of the most sophisticated logistic systems of the 18th century. Britain did not see the war as a desperate struggle for survival. It saw it as a rebellion to be suppressed. And in 1777, British strategy focused on a single objective: Philadelphia. At the time, Philadelphia was the largest city in the American colonies, with a population of nearly 40,000 people. More importantly, it was the political heart of the rebellion. The Continental Congress met there. Diplomatic correspondence flowed through its streets. Losing Philadelphia would not just mean losing territory, it would mean losing legitimacy. British command believed that capturing the city would deal a psychological blow from which the rebellion might never recover. The man chosen to execute this plan was General Sir William Howe, commander of British forces in North America. Howe led an army of approximately 15,000 British and Hessian troops, seasoned veterans trained in European-style warfare. His men were well supplied, well paid, and supported by the Royal Navy, which gave him unmatched mobility along the coast. In August of 1777, Howe launched his campaign. Rather than advancing overland from New York, he transported his army by sea, landing at the head of the Chesapeake Bay. This maneuver outflanked Washington entirely and forced the Continental Army into a hurried response. On September 11, 1777, the two armies met at the Battle of Brandywine. Washington attempted to block Howe's advance toward Philadelphia, deploying roughly 11,000 Continental soldiers along the Brandywine Creek. But British intelligence, superior reconnaissance, and disciplined flanking maneuvers decided the outcome.
Howe split his forces, fixing the Americans in place while executing a wide flanking march that struck Washington's right wing from an unexpected direction. The result was decisive. American lines collapsed, units retreated in disorder. Only the stubborn resistance of a few formations prevented complete destruction. By nightfall, Washington's army was in full retreat. Philadelphia lay open. On September 26, 1777, British troops marched into the city unopposed. For the British, it was a triumph. For the American cause, it was a disaster. The Continental Congress fled westward. Loyalist celebrations erupted in the streets. European observers watched closely, questioning whether the rebellion had reached its breaking point. Washington refused to accept that conclusion. He understood that he could not defeat the British in a conventional battle, but he also knew that the war was not decided by cities alone. As long as his army existed, the revolution lived.
So he made a dangerous choice. Rather than retreat deep into the countryside, Washington decided to strike back. The target was Germantown, a village just outside Philadelphia, where Howe's army had established extended encampments. Washington believed that a surprise attack could disrupt British control, restore morale, and prove to both allies and enemies that the Continental Army was still a fighting force. The plan was bold, some would say reckless. Washington divided his army into multiple columns, intending a coordinated night march followed by a simultaneous assault at dawn on October 4, 1777. It required precise timing, clear communication, and disciplined execution. The Continental Army had none of those advantages. As the columns advanced through the darkness, a dense fog settled over the battlefield. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Units lost contact with one another. Orders were misunderstood. Columns veered off course. When the fighting began, confusion ruled. At several points, American units fired on each other, mistaking friendly troops for the enemy. British forces, initially surprised, regrouped quickly and used their superior training to stabilize the situation. By late morning, Washington had no choice. He ordered a retreat. Once again, the Continental Army withdrew from the field. Once again, the British held their ground. Militarily, Germantown was a defeat. Strategically, it was something else entirely. European powers, especially France, took note. The Americans had attacked a superior enemy near its strongest position and survived. The revolution had not collapsed. It had endured. But for Washington and his soldiers, endurance came at a terrible cost. Casualties mounted. Supplies dwindled further. Winter was approaching, and the British still occupied Philadelphia. The war, at this moment, balanced on a knife's edge. It was in the aftermath of this failed attack, among scattered camps, tense picket lines, and soldiers exhausted by weeks of marching and fighting, that a small, almost absurd incident occurred. An event so minor it barely registered in official reports. Yet for a brief moment, it forced two enemy armies to stop, lower their weapons, and remember something they had nearly forgotten: their shared humanity. After the Battle of Germantown, the war around Philadelphia settled into an uneasy rhythm. British forces held the city, but their control was not absolute. American troops hovered at the edges, probing supply lines, watching movements, striking when opportunities appeared. Skirmishes flared and vanished. Neither side delivered a decisive blow. Washington's army withdrew north and west, eventually moving towards winter quarters. But before the long march to Valley Forge began, both armies remained close enough to hear one another's drums, cannons, and sometimes even shouted orders. This proximity created a strange battlefield environment. Men who were sworn enemies by oath and uniform often occupied positions only a few hundred yards apart. Between them lay fields, fences, hedgerows, and narrow roads. At night, campfires glowed on both sides. Voices carried in the dark. The war was constant, but it was also intimate. British pickets stood alert, muskets loaded, listening for movement. American sentries did the same. A wrong step, a snapped twig, or a misunderstood signal could ignite violence without warning. Yet, in this tense space between armies, something unexpected appeared. A dog. No one knew exactly when it first crossed the lines. Some accounts suggest it wandered during the chaos after Germantown. Others believe it had already been roaming the countryside, scavenging scraps from camps on both sides. What was certain was this: the dog was not American. It was a small terrier, well-groomed, energetic, and clearly accustomed to officers rather than soldiers. Its coat was clean, its behavior confident. This was not a stray born of war. The animal began appearing near American positions, weaving between tents, sniffing packs, accepting food without fear. Soldiers laughed. Some tried to shoo it away. Others fed it deliberately, amused by its boldness. In an army starved for morale, the dog became a curiosity. Men scratched its ears. They joked about keeping it as a mascot. In a world dominated by death, the presence of something harmless and familiar felt almost surreal. Then someone noticed the collar. Attached to it was a tag, and engraved on that tag was a name that instantly changed everything. Sir William Howe, commander of British forces in North America. For a moment, disbelief spread through the camp. This was not just any British officer. Howe was the architect of the Philadelphia campaign, the man whose army had beaten Washington at Brandywine, the general who now occupied the largest city in the colonies. And his dog was standing calmly among American troops. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some soldiers laughed harder. The irony was irresistible. Others saw an opportunity for humiliation. Keeping the dog would be a harmless way to taunt the enemy, a symbolic insult delivered without firing a shot. A few men even suggested parading the animal near British lines, letting Howe see exactly where his prized companion had ended up. In most armies, that would have been the end of the story, but this army belonged to George Washington, and Washington saw something different. He understood symbolism better than most. He knew that wars were fought not only with weapons, but with reputation, perception, and moral authority. Every action sent a message, whether intended or not. Keeping the dog would have been easy. Returning it would be harder. It would require a truce. Washington ordered the dog brought to him. Witnesses later described the scene as oddly calm. The general examined the collar, confirmed the identification, and then made his decision. The dog would be returned. Not secretly, not indirectly, openly, formally. Washington instructed that the animal be washed, fed, and cared for. Then he ordered a message prepared. A white flag would be raised. An officer would escort the dog back to British lines under a temporary cessation of hostilities. For soldiers hardened by weeks of fighting, the order was astonishing. Men who had watched friends die now stood aside to protect an enemy general's pet. As the white flag was raised, muskets were lowered on both sides. British sentries froze, then signaled back. Officers emerged cautiously. Word traveled quickly through the British camp. An American officer was approaching under truce. When the escort arrived, leading the terrier by its collar, recognition was immediate. Sir William Howe's dog had come home. Accounts suggest that Howe himself was surprised, perhaps even moved. No mocking note accompanied the return, no insult, only a brief message, respectful in tone, explaining how the dog had been found and returned unharmed. For a few minutes, the war stopped. Not officially, not permanently, but undeniably. Men on both sides watched in silence as the exchange concluded. Then the white flag lowered. The escort turned back. Muskets were raised once more. The war resumed. But something had shifted. In a conflict defined by ideology, empire, and independence, a simple act of decency had cut through the noise. Washington had sent a message not just to Howe, but to everyone watching. This was not a rebellion driven by chaos or cruelty. It was a cause grounded in principle, and that message would echo far beyond a single battlefield. The war resumed as it always did. Shots rang out again. Patrols returned to the roads and fields. Orders were shouted. Artillery repositioned. The brief pause created by a wandering dog vanished beneath the grinding machinery of conflict. But something subtle had changed. Both armies carried the memory of what they had just witnessed. For the British, the message was unsettling. The American rebellion was not a mob of angry colonists driven only by resentment. It was led by a commander who understood restraint, discipline, and the power of moral authority. For the Americans, the moment reinforced something deeper. Their struggle was not just about independence. It was about proving they were worthy of it. George Washington understood this better than anyone. At this stage of the war, the Continental Army was still fragile. Supplies were scarce, training was inconsistent, morale fluctuated with every victory and defeat. Washington knew he could not win through brute force alone. He needed legitimacy. He needed the world to see his army as something more than insurgents. And so, while cannons thundered and men died, he chose to return a dog. Soon after, Washington led his army into one of the darkest chapters of the war, Valley Forge. During the winter of 1777 to 1778, nearly 12,000 Continental soldiers encamped outside Philadelphia. What awaited them was not battle, but endurance, hunger, cold, disease. Over 2,500 men died without firing a shot. Shoes disintegrated, uniforms froze stiff. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags and left bloody footprints in the snow. Desertion haunted the camp. Supplies promised by Congress arrived late or not at all. Yet the army did not collapse. Instead, it transformed. Under the guidance of Baron von Steuben, discipline tightened. Drills became relentless. Units learned to move as one, to fire, reload, and advance with precision. By the time spring arrived, Washington commanded a force far more dangerous than the one that had entered Valley Forge. And through it all, his leadership style never changed. He punished looting, enforced discipline, demanded restraint toward civilians. He insisted that the army behave not like conquerors, but guardians of a future nation. The dog incident faded from headlines, but it did not fade from memory. Years later, British officers would remark that Washington was unlike any enemy commander they had faced, not because he was ruthless, but because he was controlled, predictable, principled. Those traits mattered. When the war expanded beyond America, drawing in France, Spain, and the Netherlands, reputation became currency. European powers watched closely, evaluating whether the rebellion deserved support. Washington's conduct mattered as much as his victories, and moments like the return of Sir William Howe's dog became quiet evidence. By 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown. There, surrounded and cut off, British General Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army. The conflict that had begun with scattered militias and uncertain alliances ended with a decisive victory. The British Empire acknowledged defeat. The United States was born. No treaty mentions a dog. No monument commemorates that brief truce. Yet the story endures because it reveals something essential. Wars are remembered for battles, strategies, and casualties, but they are shaped by character. George Washington could have kept the dog. He could have mocked his enemy. He chose something harder. In doing so, he reminded both sides that even in war, humanity still mattered. And sometimes the smallest actions speak louder than cannon fire. This is one of those moments, a story rarely told, but never forgotten by those who understand that history is not only forged by violence, but by restraint.